Hi everyone, welcome to Nature's Lens. I'm Matt Peter, I'm the land manager here at the Orchid Sanctuary. Today I'm joined by Tony Kiszonas, who is our summer naturalist, and Ben Epley, who is our summer intern. So we're here today to talk about the Orchid Restoration Project. Back in 1937, the Orchid Sanctuary was founded mostly in part to protect the wildflowers that are on the property. And a major focus of the wildflowers were the native orchid species that we have on the property. Historical records show that there were, at the time, I think about 15 recorded species of native orchids, somewhere in that ballpark. And today we, through continued efforts of surveying the property, we have recorded 26 native species with one non-native species of orchid. The Orchid Sanctuary has very strong roots in orchid restoration and protection. So back in 2015 is when we started the Orchid Restoration Project. It's 2015, is that right?
2015 is when the plots went in. It started just previous to that with some hand pollination and seed collection that were then germinated off-site and brought back here as seedlings.
Okay. So 2015 is when we put the plots in the ground. This project was a result of some data and a little bit more of anecdotal evidence that we're losing some populations of our orchids, especially along the trails. So we wanted to really understand if we're losing different species, why we're losing them, and what we can do to bring them back. So with that in mind, we started with the Ram's Head orchid, which its native range extends north from Wisconsin up into Canada. And throughout its entire native range, it has some sort of designation where it's either listed as state threatened or state endangered, or something similarly in Canada. So technically it probably could be listed on a federal level, but it's not, and it affords us an interesting opportunity to research and try to figure out what we can do to bring the populations back up. So with that in mind, we established 19 of these research plots. These are 2 meter by 2 meter square plots, and they have 150 or so Ram's Head orchids that have been outplanted in each of them. The Ram's Heads have been, the seeds have been collected from the property. They've been sent off to a couple of various labs, and they were germinated there and then sent back to us as seedlings. So those seedlings we then outplanted in these different monitoring plots. So again, there are 19 of these spread across the boardwalk area here and into the property elsewhere. And we come back every single year to count how many orchids have come back, and then take different measurements and different data regarding how much they've grown, their height, leaf length and width, and especially whether they've been flowering. So that's really the key here. When you outplant Ram's Head orchid, or any orchid for that matter, your success is really determined by the ability of an outplanted population to be able to reproduce. So if you outplant a bunch of orchids, or any plant, and they don't flower, well then that may not necessarily be considered a successful restoration, even if those plants keep coming back up. So if the plants are reproducing and spreading those seeds out for future generations of Ram's Head, then we know that things are going well. So what we're looking at here is we're looking at one of our more successful plots, and unfortunately we did have 2 individuals that were flowering, but they've been eaten by some critters, unfortunately. So but this is a really good example of what Ram's Head habitat may look like in our area here. And this is also a good example to show you our data loggers, which are on that back side. So we have these automatic data loggers at some of the plots, and they will take, every 5 minutes, they take a reading from a light sensor, which is that black knob that's hanging out there, and then there's 2 sensors that are buried in the ground. There's soil moisture and soil temperature. So we've determined those 3 characteristics to be important for determining whether an area is good habitat for the Ram's Head orchid or not. So we have 6 of these spread out at the 6 most successful plots, and those were deployed last year. And then luckily this year, with some more grant funding, we were able to establish 6 wild populations. So we do have wild populations of ram's head orchids, and some of those populations are doing really well. So we were able to develop 1 meter by 1 meter squared monitoring plots there. And with grant funding, we were able to buy 6 more sets of the data loggers with those 3 sensors. So we'll be able to take the data from the wild plots and then compare them to the data from the outplanted monitoring experimental plots here. And that will really give us the picture of what are the habitat requirements out in the wild, and then compare that with, well, what are the conditions in the successful plots here, and then see where the overlap is, and then we'll get that range of those environmental conditions. So once we make that comparison, we find the range of those conditions, and then there's other factors too to take into account, such as presence of certain fungus in the soil that the orchids need to successfully grow in the wild. We can take all that information, and then we can start to target areas on the property that may be conducive to supporting populations of ram's head orchids. So that's the end goal. The end goal is to not have experimental plots, but actually find habitat on the property that will hopefully support populations, outplant there, and then monitor those going forward to make sure that they're reaching sexual maturity, producing seeds, and propagating the species into the future.
Orchids are a very, very particular species or grouping of plants for some of them. And every bit of data that comes out about the lady slipper orchids, particularly the ram's head lady slipper orchid, indicates that it's got a very, very persnickety growth pattern that has to have conditions just right. Matt alluded to the fact of getting an overlap of conditions, and our statistician refers to it as a sweet spot for conditions. So it needs not only the right amount of light, it needs the right temperatures, it needs the right moisture, it needs the right companion plants, but it also has to have a fungus symbiont that allows it to germinate and then provide some sugars for its growth processes. So it's got a whole laundry list of fairly complicated types of ingredients that we're trying to establish the best possibility for restorations. They're not just willy-nilly throwing seeds to the wind like we do with milkweed and hope that they take. The orchid grouping of plants tends to be a little bit more finicky than many common plants that we're familiar with. So that's why we're really putting a lot of energy and endeavors in trying to establish, again, that sweet spot that we can best ensure a restoration project, and then continue that with some of our other populations of orchids. There's probably more than 26,000 different of these critters around, ranging from a fairly rare plant called a ghost orchid down in the tropics to a little tiny guy like the ram's head, to club spurs up here, and many people are familiar with the yellow lady slipper. So they're really all over the world, and many different characteristics. There are some that have a specially evolved a pollen delivery system that requires a specially evolved moth in which to pollinate them. And Darwin had that figured out way back when, in the mid-1800s, and predicted the existence of the pollinator because after looking at the flowers. So there's quite a diversity. There's one orchid that actually has a trigger mechanism on its stigma area in order to achieve pollination. So they're quite a broad variety of things on pretty much every continent, with the exception, and that may change as time goes by also. We may see them growing down there too, so we just never know.
The Ridges, as a small not-for-profit, there's only so much that we can do with the resources that we have available to us. So we're obviously the location to do the research, and we have some of the personnel on staff to do the boots on the ground sort of research. But luckily, We have a partnership with the University of Wisconsin Green Bay and the Smithsonian, where some of the more intensive and some of the more specialized lab work is completed by those entities. So the University of Wisconsin Green Bay, we partner with Dr. Lisa Grubishaw and her lab. So currently Jason Miller is the grad student who's working with us on this project, looking at trying to identify the fungal associates for the ram's head, because that's one of the questions that we need answered if we want to have successful outplantings. We also need to try to test the soil to see if these fungus that they rely on are present in those areas. So, but we have to know what those different fungal species are first. So the Smithsonian's also working on that. The Smithsonian's taking that scope and broadening it to the entire, country, and they're getting samples from people all over the country, where they're identifying those fungal associates in the roots. They're collecting leaf samples from all the different orchid species, as many as they can, for DNA sequencing, and then they are being sent seeds from the orchids for archival purposes. So with us and then the Smithsonian and EW Green Bay, we're all joining forces to try to answer a lot of questions about orchids, but our main interest here is the ram's head right now.
And we do depend very, very heavily on our volunteers for everything from monitoring our plots to finding the orchids out in the wild to doing some of the germination work they've been trained on and have been working on that. So honestly, this project would not be existing without a very, very passionate group of volunteers that are really the backbone of this operation.
Absolutely.
Okay, what we are looking at right now is one of the ram's head orchids out in the wild that we were talking with you about at the plot a ways back. And a plant generally has to be a certain height in order to flower, and there's a pretty consistent predictability with that. And here are the remnants of the flower, and then behind the flower they have where the pollen will grow from the fertilization aspect right in here where the eggs are, and this should form then what's called the seed capsule. And we can see right in this particular area a seed capsule formation that hopefully there's been a successful pollination, successful fertilization, and come late summer, early fall, hopefully this structure will be ready to split open and emit thousands and thousands of what are called dust seeds. And from there we hope that the seeds will find a good place to land and a good fungus to germinate them, and that we can keep this particular population intact.
Cool.
We are standing right now in one of two shade houses that we have on the property. So throughout the process of Orchid Restoration Project, at least in our minds, you collect the seeds, you get the seeds will be germinated in a lab type setting, and then they grow for a little bit and they turn into seedlings. Well, eventually at some point they need to be planted in some sort of substrate. Once you get a bunch of seedlings, then you plant them in trays in appropriate substrate, and then they kind of are just staged in these shade houses until they're ready to be planted out into their natural habitat. So shade houses, they're essentially just greenhouses, but instead of the glass and the plastic, we have these shade cloths so that they are still exposed to the elements. We try not to baby them too much because essentially, ultimately they're just native plants that need to grow out in nature, so we need to make sure that we give them enough assistance until they can kind of grow on their own. So we want to shade them to sort of similar conditions as they would see, and then leave them exposed to the air and water, and they even stay out here in the winter because again, ultimately that's what's going to happen with them. They're going to be out in the ground and be frozen solid at some point. So So the reason that we have so many here is because when we started the Orchid Restoration Project, we focused on 5 species. 4 of them were lady slippers, so the yellow lady slipper, the showy lady slipper, the pink moccasin, and then the ram's head lady slipper. And then the 5th one is grass pinks, which are right here. So we have 4 out of those 5 species in here, except for the ram's head, which, like I had mentioned, we have outplanted in our experimental monitoring plot. So the rest of them are living life here in the shade house until we feel comfortable enough identifying the proper habitat for them. Because the last thing you want to do is put all the time and effort into growing these orchids and then just willy-nilly throw them in the ground wherever, and then they don't survive. So these trays right here may look a little bit different because these are the pink moccasins and their habitat's a little bit different than the other orchids that we have here in the shade house. So they like a little bit drier, a little bit more acidic soil, so that's why you see all the pine needles that are on top of them. They also get watered with a very light vinegar mixture. And then next to them here you can see these are showy lady slippers. You can tell because the foliage is a little bit tighter, grows a little bit more upright, and it's really fuzzy. It's really hairy. So and then what's really exciting about the orchids this year, as you can see as you pan around, is that this is the first year that we've had flowers for the yellows, and we're getting little flowering buds on the showies as well. So that's really exciting. So these plants are about 5 years old, give or take. Some batches came a little bit later than others, but in general we say they're 5 years old, and that's about the time frame that we would expect for an orchid out in nature to reach sexual maturity. It would be about 5 years. So the fact that they are surviving in relatively large numbers and are now flowering in again relatively large numbers, something that was unexpected. It wasn't really on our radar. We didn't really know what to expect with plants that are just sitting in shade houses, but obviously they're happy enough that they're growing and trying to reproduce. So so here's where they exist, and people are welcome to come back and take a peek at them whenever they come visit and go for a hike. We just ask that people stay out of the shade houses. They can view them from the other side of the screen.